Greetings, folks. Tom Affolter here, and today we're going to be talking about some methods that Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio has for data migration. And data migration is nothing more than a term used to copy data from one source to another source. Sometimes we might be simply copying from one database on the computer to a brand new database, another database on that same server and that same computer. Or we might be copying from one SQL server perhaps to somebody else's or a remote SQL server. But some of the stuff that we're going to take a look at, especially the data transformation services, allows us to copy data from a variety of different sources and to a variety of different sources. And it doesn't just have to be SQL Server. I could use the services that Microsoft has to copy a database from Access to MySQL if I wanted to. And we'll take a look at that in just a minute. But let me back up here and talk about the three different techniques that we're going to take a look at within this demonstration, at least, to look at data migration. And the first one, as I just mentioned, is DTS, which is Data Transformation Services. And the DTS services allows us to copy all or part of a database, be it tables or views or whatever is in it, into another location. And it could be into an existing database, it could be into a brand new database, it could be someplace else, as I mentioned a moment ago. We'll take a look at some of those rules on that in just a moment. The second example that we're going to take a look at is exporting data to a data tier application. Now, a data tier application is kind of a new geeky term that Microsoft has come out with. You'll recall back, hopefully, if you took Introduction to Programming, that we talked about three different types of tiers that we have when we develop applications. We have the presentation tier, the business logic tier, and we have the data tier. Now, the presentation tier is used for presentation to the user. So if we were doing a website, the presentation obviously would be whatever the user sees and interacts with, the HTML, the forms, what have you. The business logic part, the middle part, is really the guts of the program. That's where all the work is done. The connection that might exist to a database or to a shopping cart, the processing that occurs, everything that you have to write code for, typically as a developer, is going to go within that business logic tier. The other tier we would talk about is the data tier. And the data tier is responsible for managing all the data. Well, if you take that aspect, that the data tier is responsible for managing all the data, then that's what we have right here when we're dealing with the server and the data that exists on the server, and that's why they call this the data tier application. And really, it probably should be called more so the data tier of the application, because a data tier by itself is going to do absolutely nothing. It has to have a presentation to have a user be able to interact with it, and that data has to be manipulated somehow with the business logic. So we'll take a look at that one as well. And then we're going to close out by looking at one of the more wordy methods that Microsoft has included, but also one of the more versatile methods, and that is generating a script off of the schema and the data. And you'll recall that we talked about schema. Schema is the entire skeleton of our database. That part, if you will, that is not the data itself or the information itself. In fact, we talked about data being organized into information. It's the schema that organizes that data to become information. So let's go ahead and get started here in just a second. And I want to start by explaining that I'm logged in currently right now as the admin, but it wouldn't make any difference whether I'm logged in as admin or not. What I have to be able to pull data out is to have read privileges to that data. In most cases, what I'm going to show you right now, you could do across the board with read privileges to the data that I provide you. So what I'm going to do to start off with is I'm going to highlight contributions down here as I'm logged in. And with contributions selected, I'm going to go ahead and take the data in contributions and I'm going to push it into a new database that I created, and you'll see it down below here, called gJetson. And I created a user for it. So I'm simulating the fact that I'm a student right now. The student is got a login of gJetson, and I'll come back to that in a moment in that aspect that's going to be the most important for you. So right now, with contributions, I'm going to take the data that's in contributions and I'm going to push it into G-Jetson's database. The other thing that I could do is I could be sitting inside G-Jetson and I could say I want to grab the data from contributions and pull it into G-Jetson. So there's a method called the push method. That's if you're sitting in where the data originates and you're going to push it into where it's going to go. And there's the other method called the pull method that says, oh, I'm in the destination, I'm going to pull it from the original source. They both function almost identically the same way. So let's go ahead and start off with contributions and let's use the push method. It should become pretty obvious how you could use the pull method in just a second here. So the first thing I'm going to do is do a right click on contribution. I'm going to move down to export data. Now there you go. I'm exporting data to a new location. I'm pushing it from contributions into some other location. If I was sitting at where I want the data to go, I'd be selecting import. But other than that, they're going to operate almost exactly the same way. But I'm going to select export here. And it starts out a wizard. I just leave it turned on. I'm going to click next to get started. So the first thing it wants to know is, what is the source of the data? Where is that data going to come from? And notice right off the bat, it doesn't automatically assume that the data is going to come from another SQL server. And in fact, with this drop down, I can pick all these different data sources that exist in here, things like MySQL or Oracle. There's another older version of SQL Server. There's a flat file source. Flat file source would be if I want to use a comma delimited file. And then there's some newer drivers that exist out here that Microsoft has made special. Obviously, if the database is Microsoft that it's transferring from or connecting to, Microsoft's going to provide better or more tools. Notice then that I can pull my data out of Microsoft Access, and it really depends on which engine Microsoft Access has that you're pulling data from. We don't use Microsoft Access, and nor do I personally recommend that you use Microsoft Access unless you absolutely have to. Notice I also have Excel here. I can pull data out of Excel, and when I do that, it will give me the option of saying what you're pulling in, does it have column headers? If it has column headers at the very top of it, I'm going to assume that those are going to be the column names when I convert that data. And of course, there are some other things in here that we don't use that are just embedded here because SQL Server uses them for other purposes. But down below here, if we get a little bit further down, you'll see that we have SQL Server Native Client. We're going to want to use the 11.0. That's the most current way that SQL Server talks. And since our data is coming from SQL Server and going to the same exact SQL Server, we're going to go ahead and select this guy right now. And immediately you're going to see that it comes up with a login. If it doesn't include the server name right here, which it should because we're already logged in, then you would go ahead and fill in that IP address for our server. We can't use Windows authentication because none of us have Windows authentication. We're going to use SQL Server, and we're going to put in the login that gives us access to the contributions table. So in your case, you would be putting in your login. In my case, I'm going to put in mine and my password. Now, of course, within here, I could make changes and change it from the selected database that I have over here into a different database, but in most cases, you're not going to want to do that. Before I go on, let's point out, it's asking me what is the source of the data? Where's the data coming from? And if you read it, it says it's coming off of this server, and here is the database that the data is going to be coming from. Here's the IP address to get to it. Here's the login, etc. Let's move forward. Next, we choose our destination, where we want our data ultimately to go. So what I need to do is go ahead and make sure I've got the right IP address. Make sure I have my login, and now I pick the destination database of where it's going to go. And in this case, I want to have it go to my G-Jetson. So now I've got to review, make sure everything is filled out correctly. I picked out SQL Server Native Client 11.0. Again, my destination could have been any one of these data sources we had before. And in fact, I could have done, as I mentioned before, a MySQL to a different MySQL using these exact same tools. But I've got everything selected. I'm going to go ahead and click Next. So the next question it has for me is, does it want me to copy the data from one or more tables, or do I want to write select statements on my own to pull out subsets perhaps of some of the data? Well, in my case and in most cases, I'm going to go ahead and tell it that I want to select the data from the tables or the views as they exist. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next. Now, the next thing it tells me is what tables exist within my database. And you'll notice at the very top, you'll see one called sys diagrams. Normally, you're never going to want to export sys diagrams. You can't really do that. Sys diagrams is a method that we would use to create an ERD, which we haven't really talked about yet. I might have shown you one that was created with it, but we don't ever want sys diagrams. Really, the two tables that we want that exist within contributions, and by the way, this is a massive, massive table. There's nearly 1 million records that I have in it, and that's why I chose to use this method. In fact, I should mention that if you've got a very large amount of data and you want to move that across, we're really only going to have two different methods within SQL Server that we could use. This method and the script method that I'm going to show you at the end. And the reason that's important is that allows us to move data into existing databases, whereas that second method I'm going to show you here in a moment won't allow that. So at this particular point, I want to select the table or tables that I want to go ahead and move into gJETSON. And I want to move both of these in right here. So go ahead and select it. Now, before I go on, I could go back in there and do a little bit of modification. I can edit mappings, and mappings basically says that if I'm going to move table donations from my source into my destination, it's going to be the same table name and the same column names. But if I want, I can go back in and edit my mappings. Let me just click on it and change my column names. So here's an example of the column names. And in fact, I can even change my data types if I wanted to do that. Normally, you're not going to want to do that. I'm going to go ahead and click OK to get back here. And if I want to preview the data to see what it's going to look like, I can click Preview, and it's going to show me a subset of the data. Now, why is that important? Well, in this particular case, it's not that important because you can expect that the database is going to move across cleanly. But you might be reading data coming out of a comma delimited file or out of a spreadsheet, and this is the opportunity you might otherwise have to look at the data to make sure, is it being read correctly? I'm going to go ahead and click OK here. And just making sure everything is correct, I click Next. And the next thing it wants to know is, do you want me to go ahead and run this immediately, the command that you just gave me, do that conversion, do that migration, if you will, or do you want me to go ahead and save this to a SQL Server package? And a SQL Server package is basically a script, so I could save what I just recorded and not execute it, but store it as a script and then later run it on demand if I want to do that. Actually, what I like to do is run this immediately, so I'm going to go ahead and click Next here. It's just going to give me a little bit of information about what I selected, tell me what my source is. It's going to tell me what my destination is and what I'm going to be copying. In this particular case, it tells me there's going to be two tables. Table donations, which is the massive table of almost 1 million records, and another table of zip codes, and that is simply all the zip codes that exist in the United States, or at least last time I downloaded, which we will use later, by the way. I'm going to go ahead and click Finish. Now, what's going to happen, it's going to take a little bit of time to go through. It's going to take all that data, it's going to move it across record by record. When it's done, it's going to come back and report to me that it's done. So as you can see, 12 minutes later, the process is completed. And you can see in here that table donations had 923,716 rows transferred across, and there were 42,985 different rows, or it tells me there are 42,985 zip codes in the United States. Let's go ahead and test it out and see if this works. I'm going to go ahead and close it out. let's move down to George Jetson and let's refresh the tables. So I can just sit here, do a refresh, and now the data has showed up. And if we look in here, we're going to see that we have the fields for donations, and we have the fields for zip codes. The challenge that we have, though, is let's go back and take a look at the original data. Let's open up contributions. Let's look at the design under columns. And notice that the very first column here is listed as a primary key, yet down below here, the very first column in donations does not have a primary key on it. And that is one of the problems that we're going to get with this DTS is that primary keys and counter fields do not follow. And in fact, I believe this is a counter field, and a counter field is a field that automatically increments itself to provide uniqueness. And then you use it as a primary key or as a surrogate key, as we probably discussed already. First thing that we have to do now is go back in and make changes to this data to match the original table. And let's go ahead and modify the structure of table donations. I click design here. Typically, especially in my designs, the top field is always going to be the primary key. And also notice that if the top field is an integer, most likely it's going to be a counter or an identity field. So the very first thing we need to do is make this a primary key. So we right click and we do it as set primary key. The next thing we need to do is set it as a identity field. How do you know whether it's going to be an identity field or not? You're going to have to know your data. First thing I would do is list the data out and see if it looks like it's sequential data, numeric. There's always a possibility that somebody's decided they're going to put an integer field in here. It's going to be a primary key, and you have to identify, or you have to assign a number. I've never seen that in my many years of working with databases, but I don't want to say never. But in this particular case, and throughout this course, you're going to find out that anytime you see an integer field that is on the top field, that is a primary key, it's going to be an identity. And the way that you reset or set an identity is you go to the column properties with it set, you look down below until you see identity specification, you open that up, and is identity yes. Now I'm going to go ahead and save it. First thing I do, if there's any errors, meaning that there are duplicates in here and it can't be a primary key, or there are duplicate numbers, that's going to catch it regardless as a primary key. But an identity field would also block us, even if it wasn't a primary key, if there were duplicate numbers. Identities have to be unique numbers. So I'm going to go ahead and click save, make sure it worked. And it tells me that it may take a while for it to save data, considerable amount of time. I guarantee it won't take the 12 minutes it took to convert that data to do that. In fact, we're going to find out this is going to happen pretty doggone quick. Go ahead and click yes. And right now it's restructuring the table with the changes. Usually takes no more than maybe 15 or 20 seconds for this to occur. And there it is. It's done. We've got that table corrected. Now I'm going to come back down to table zip codes. I'm going to do a right click on table zip codes. I'm going to go back into the design. And if you think about it logically, there's only one zip code number, and it better have a city and state. If this is table of zip codes, that should provide the uniqueness. And if you're not sure, go back and look at your data. And even if you're incorrect, you're going to get an error that tells you that you cannot make a certain field a primary key. For example, if I tried to make state primary key, which I could down here, and I save it, it's going to give me an error. It's going to say you can't make state primary key because there's duplicates inside. Exactly. See, duplicate keys were found. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that that's not the primary key. I'm going to set the zip code to the primary key. And then at that point, I should be able to hit save. It resaves that data again, and no errors occur. So let's go back in before we leave this first method and review exactly how I did that. I did the push method, which meant I sat in the database that I had read access to. While I was in that database, I decide to push it into another database. Most likely in your case, it's going to be your personal database. So I would do a right click. I went down to my tasks. I selected export data. Click next, and then I filled in the data source. I filled in the destination. I selected the table or tables that I wanted. I went ahead and clicked next. I ran and executed it, and it moved the data across. That is method number one. Let's take a look at method number two, and it's a different type of method. Really, the method I'm going to show you right now I can use with contributions. I think I'm going to do anyway, because it really doesn't fall in exactly the same realm as these other two examples I'm going to give you. What this method does is allows me to make a complete backup copy of a particular database that I'm working on, and then I have the ability to restore that database under a different name. I have to do it in its entirety, meaning that a moment ago I could have selected tables, and you will do this, and moved it into your database and continue to go back and select tables and never affected the original tables that were in your database. In this particular example that I'm going to use right now, it doesn't work that way. In this example, I can make a complete copy of contributions, and let's maybe not even use contributions because it's large. Let's pick a smaller one here. Let's pick the weather one. So what I want to do is I want to make a complete copy, a backup copy of the weather as it exists right now. Why? Security purposes maybe. I'm going to go ahead and right click here. I'm going to go to tasks as I did before, but this time what I want to do is I want to export a data tier application. This is method number two. So I click on this. It's going to walk me through a wizard. Now the wizard's a little bit different because this is not going to allow me to move data from one server to the next. What it's going to allow me to do is package data into a file, and then later I can take that package and move it into a different server if I choose. This is really more of a method for backing up data. So let's go ahead and take a look and see how this works. Go ahead and click next. Again, keep in mind that I had the weather database selected. It wants to know if I want to save this where. Now I have a choice of saving it to a local disk or using Microsoft Cloud Azure to save to. We don't have the scope right now to go through Azure, so we're just going to save this file locally. So I'm going to go ahead and browse and find a good location to put it. Let's see it. I got a location here called school data. I put it in my desktop, and I'm going to give it a name. So I'm backing up weather, so I'm just going to call it my weather. What it's going to do is going to take all the elements, all the schema, or at least it's going to give me that option, all the schema and all the data. It's going to package it together in a script, and then it's going to zip that script up into a small file, and it's going to be a single file that I can move perhaps to another server, and then I can import that data application if I want to. So I'm backing up this weather DB, and I'm going to call it weather. I told it where it's going to place it on my local computer, not on the SQL server remotely, but on my local computer. Now I'm going to go ahead and click save, and then I click next. And at that point, it's just going to come back and give me a little bit of synopsis about what I'm doing, just as we saw in the previous wizard. And when I've completed it, I click finish. And right now it's going back in, and just as I said before, it's packaging all that schema up. And unlike that previous example, it's not moving it to another server, it's moving it to this zip file. And it's, even though it's a zip file, it gives the extension of backpack, PAC at the end of it. So now it tells me everything worked, that was able to make the copy. Let's go back out and let's take a look and see if I can find that location on my desktop. So let me go to my desktop here, open up my school data, and I've got a whole bunch of different backups that I've made, but right here is the one that we just created, the weather backpack, and notice it's only 16 kilobytes of data. Now it looks like it's an obscure file, but if I went ahead and added a different extension on it, .zip, renamed it, and now opened it up, there's all the data that was just backed up. You'll notice that there's in an XML format. There's all the data that exists right here backed up in this particular folder. And it all exists within that particular backpack file. So now I'm going to rename that backpack file back to what it was initially. I've now got this backup made. I've now gone to another server. Maybe this is my final staging server and I want to actually make this data live to my customers. So now I have to open that server up. So what I would do is I jump back to that particular server. I'm going to walk into this server right here, okay, as though I'm doing it from scratch. This is going to bring in a brand new database. I can't select a database down below. What I'm going to do is select databases above, and right here I'm going to import a data tier application. And it's going to walk me through a wizard. So I'm now, just as an example, showing you how I would restore that data back into my server. Why is this important to you, by the way? This is important to you because you might do some development on a local SQL server. A local SQL server is one that's embedded generally within Visual Studio. You may do some work in it, and you might at some point decide you want to move that to a different server. You could use this method if you wanted to, number one, to back it up. You could also use that very first method as well, but again, you'd lose some of those data constraints. So I'm importing the data. I started the wizard. I'm going to click Next. Now it wants to know where the file's coming from. I'm going to browse, and there's my weather backpack. Why didn't it show all those other files we saw a minute ago? Because it's filtering right now only to the backpack files. That's why I changed it back from that zip to backpack a moment ago. So I select that file, I click Open, and now what I do is I click Next. Now it realizes that I cannot name it the same thing it had before, meaning that I can't go back in this database and name it WeatherDB. So it's going to provide an example of a name that it wants me to use, because obviously it can't overwrite the previous one and it can't merge it with the previous one. So I have to give it a totally different name, and it arbitrarily selected weather. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just leave it the way it is. I probably would want to be a little bit more creative, and I click Next. It's going to, just like all those other wizards, it's going to give me that synopsis of what I just did, where the data's come from, and actually on my SQL server at the community colleges, on that physical SQL server, where that data is going to be stored at. And then I click Finish. So right now it's going back out there, grabbing that file, unzipping it, and it's creating the data. It shouldn't take very long because this is a very small table. It only includes 365 records, one record for each day of the year. I should also point out before we leave this example that for you to be able to do this, you have to have write privileges on the server. So you can expect that possibly you can create the backpack of your files, but you will not be able to go back to my server, to the school server, and do a restore. You would have to do that on your own server if you wanted to do that. So let's close out of this. And what I'd like to do now is show you the very last method. And that is the script method of moving data back and forth. And what the script method is very interesting. What it does is it recreates all the code that was originally used to create the data that was entered. So not only does it go back in there and recreate the structure or write the code that was used to create the structure, but it also goes back in every single record that was created. It goes back in and writes the code for that. So let me give you, for instance, on how that works. Let's go back to the weather database. And what I'd like to do now is I'm going to script this database, all the data within this database, to a single file. So I'm going to do a right click here, move over to tasks, and then from tasks, I'm going to generate scripts. Now, as soon as I generate the scripts, another wizard pops open. And you start getting the hint now that a lot of the tools Microsoft has are wizard based. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next to get started. It's looking at that particular table that I had selected, database, WeatherDB, and it's allowing me to select information. So it says, now, do I want to select a script that grabs all the database objects, or do I want to be able to select those objects on my own? I want to, in this case, select the objects on my own. So I'm going to go ahead and click this bottom radio button here, and it enables me now to open up And as it just so happens, I have a whole bunch of users that I didn't want to move across. That's why I selected the bottom one. And of this single table, that's all I really want to grab. I'm going to go ahead and click on that table and click Next. Now this is where you have to make a couple of small changes. First thing it wants to know is, where do you want me to go ahead and put the script that I'm going to create? And remember, this script is an extended SQL. Extended SQL is far more than what we're learning in this class with the ANSI SQL, even though I will contend that the ANSI SQL is far more important. It's the skeleton of everything that we do. But nonetheless, Transact SQL does some really cool stuff. And that's what's going to happen, is it's going to generate a Transact SQL series of commands for me, or a script. And then I can take that script and go into another computer and run that script and have, or into another database, if you will, and run that script and have all that data created. So let's go ahead and prove that that's going to happen. First thing I need to do is make sure that everything on this screen is filled out correctly, and it's not. I do want to save this script to a specific location, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that script, and I think what I like to do is put it back into where we were at just a moment ago. So I'm going to go back to my desktop. I'm going to select school data, and I'm going to take the script and I'm going to call that script, I'll call it my weather right now. You can see up above I've already created it once before. Let's go ahead and click Save. And that just simply writes the name and the location to where the file is going to be located at. Now, next thing that you have to do is you have to click on this Advanced button, because if I went ahead and I ran it right now, I wouldn't end up with what I want. I want to have a little bit more. So right down here towards the bottom, there's two things that you need to change. The first thing is, you don't want it to embed a use database statement in the script. Why is that? Because the very first thing that the use database statement is going to embed in it is use weather.db. So if you've got your database selected and you run this script, immediately it's going to jump away from your database and try to install the data in its original location, and that's certainly not what we want. We could open up the script later if we wanted to and delete that particular line out, but it's certainly a lot easier just to come right to this spot right here where it says script use database and tell it, nope, false. I don't want to do that. And then the very next line down below tells it what is it moving across. And right now, if I ran this script the way it sits, it's only going to move the schema across, which means it's going to move everything I've got in the design across, but not one piece of data. I want the schema and the data to go across. So what I'm going to select right here under types of data to script, hit that drop down, and I want schema and data. Notice I can do data only if I've already got an existing schema out there, but I'm going to do schema and data. And go ahead and click OK. Double check everything. Got a location for it to go. It's going to go into a single file. It's not going to go to the clipboard. I want it to go right to that file. We've told it through the advanced features that we want to go ahead and make sure that it does not use that use statement at the very top. We made sure that the schema and the data was being copied. Let's go ahead and click Next. We get that synopsis again. You're telling us exactly what we're doing, where the data is going to go. Click Next. And right now it's going back in and creating all that script. It was very, very, very quick. Let's go back and take a look and see what that script looks like. And to open that script up, rather than go back into that folder like we did before, which we can, and that script is my weather right there, I'm going to open it up. So I'm going to grab that address right there. I'm going to open that up from George Jetson. So if I go to George Jetson and I say I want to do new query, okay, now with George Jetson selected, I do a file, open. I want to open up a file, which is a script file right here, and it just happened because I'd been here once before, remembered where I was. Let me find my weather script right there. Let's click open, and here is what it created for us. And this is an amazing tool. I've created these by hand before, and now Microsoft gives it to us. Take a look at what we've got. First things it did is it put a little bit of code at the top that told it when it runs these commands, don't be verbose or don't show the information up on the screen again. Then the next thing it did is it says immediately create this table, and it tells it exactly where to create the table. It tells it what to do, which ones are going to be the primary key. It tells it all the fields, what the data type is. When we do the design, as we're going to see, and we'll understand this later, this is what's being created for us behind the scenes. Now, once that's created, and by the way, each of these go commands say, do the previous command before you continue on. So this go command right here says, first build a table before you come back in and do what? You insert 365 different records into that table, and it does all the work. Basically, this does what we would have to type in by hand, so it's inserting into a particular field all this different data right here. With George Jetson selected and this script on the screen, all I have to do is execute it. When I execute it, it's going to create the table and it's going to insert all these records. Let's go ahead and see if it's going to work. So I'm going to go ahead and do the check here, make sure everything looks good. Tells me that there are no errors in it. And now let's go ahead and execute it. So I'm going to execute the command. And depending on how much data exists out here, and right now it completed that quickly. Let's go back and prove that it worked. So I'm going to open up my tables. You don't see it here because the package doesn't update itself on its own. So I have to go back over the tables, do a refresh. And when I do a refresh on the tables, let's try that again. There is my Spokane 2017 table. And what is interesting about this is it moves it across with my primary keys. And although I see a primary key wasn't selected on this one, but it should follow the primary keys. In this case, since it didn't, let's go ahead and do that ourselves. And this is a unique primary key. So let's go to Design. Because I cannot make month primary key, why? Up to 31 different records that share the same month. For example, the month 1 will exist for the day 1 all the way through the end of the month. So that cannot be a primary key. Day can't be a primary key because all 12 months have a day 1 or a day 2. So they're being duplicated as well. So what I could do in this particular case is I could create an identity column. But one other method that is used, and I'm going to use that in this particular example, is use what's called a compound primary key. And a compound primary key says I'm going to select both of them, just like that, both fields. I'm going to make them collectively the primary key. And by collectively, it means that in a combination of the two, they'll never be a duplicate. There'll never be a duplicate January 1st or January 30th. It'll never be duplicated. So let me go ahead and close that out and save it. And as long as I'm at it, let me jump down below here and look at my weather. And let's open up that table design. And let's make that correction so you don't see that in the future. It should have been on that data originally. This data is brand new. Corrected that one. Let's go ahead and save it. And we're good to go. So let me back up one more time and let's review exactly what I just did, because you're going to want to go back in and you're going to use some of these in an exercise in a moment I should say. Open up weather database. What I want to do is I want to export the weather database, but I want to export it as a script. So let me close all this out. Close everything out here. I want to export it as a script. Doesn't matter as long as I've got read access to it. Right click. Go to tasks. Generate scripts. I have my opening screen, which by the way you can get rid of if you don't want. Click next. It identifies all the data that's going to go across. Either I have an option of everything or option 2 where I can select. I will almost always pick option 2. I open it up. I tell it that I want that table to move across or migrate. Click next. And again, I give it a name. I have to always go into advanced, remember. Come down below, make sure that I turn off the use database or it won't work for you. And I have to make sure that I tell it that I want to have schema and data. You have to do that within the advanced. And then after that, I just next through it and I'm completed. So it's a pretty easy process to move data around. I will give you an assignment here shortly on having you move the data that we've got, that we've just experienced, into your database. So let's continue on.